Hey nerdy knitters, Tanya here. Get your favorite beverage and your knitting and let's settle in and have a good chat. I don't have any knitting news to share this week, but one little bit of information that somebody left in a comment that I thought I would share because I thought it was very useful. N. Williams said that she can access Craftsy through her local library. And I know that our library here, we can access different things through the library website, different apps and things like that. I've used different foreign language apps with my daughter. We homeschool, so we use a lot of library resources. So that's something worth checking out. If your library has an online website or an online presence, then you can look into that and see if you have different apps or resources or things like Craftsy available for free right through your library. But we do have some knitting questions to answer, and like any week, I would love it if you would comment, share your thoughts and opinions, and we can keep discussing different things that people want to talk about. One of those things was about frustration when you make knitting mistakes. One of the comments from Kaz was about how she would get frustrated, she'd see her mistakes, so she would end up ripping out her knitting and then just moving on to another project. And I encouraged her just to stick with it and keep working on that one project. And then last week we also discussed another comment that was left about that fear of failure, of not wanting to try something new or maybe difficult because you were afraid that you might not be able to do it. And then we had a comment left about that from Joyce. This is her comment. Since I've not been knitting in years and have just recently picked up my needles again, I'm considering myself a new knitter right now, and I struggle with being kind to myself regarding my skills and aptitude when I catch a mistake. So I make an effort consistently to tell myself we seek progress, not perfection. I praise myself for recognizing the mistake. It's just as important to be able to recognize a mistake. And I would have to say that recognizing a mistake means you are making progress. What a great comment. And it's absolutely so true. When you're absolutely new, you can't even tell what a mistake looks like. You can't tell that things aren't, you can probably tell they're not quite right, but you don't know that you've really made a mistake. But as you progress in your skills and you look at your knitting, you can see, oh, I've made a mistake. That's a skill in itself to be able to recognize that mistake. So thank you, Joyce, for leaving that comment. I thought that was really great, something we hadn't discussed already, but even if you think your skills aren't progressing, they really are. You can recognize the mistakes you make. That's a good thing. The next question is from Clara. I need to make a shawl for a size 3 or 4 plus size woman. She wants it to go around her with a longer wingspan. Now she left this question on the tutorial for a bottom-up triangle shawl, but this can apply to lots of different shawl shapes, but we'll use the bottom-up, top-down triangles as an example because I think those are fairly common, at least the top-down triangle is, where you work increases at each edge, then you work 2 increases down the center, and then it just slowly increases out to a triangle shape. And I agree with her. I prefer shawls that have a longer wingspan. I am larger, and sometimes the shawl just doesn't feel very big. I want something that can feel more cuddly and lush and soft, and sometimes the shawls get really deep, but they don't get very wide, and that can be adjusted by your rate of increasing. Now, if you think of that top-down triangle shawl with those increases at the edges and then 2 increases in the middle, so you usually have 4 increases worked on one row every 2 rows. But if you want to adjust the length of it, not the depth of the shawl, but you want it to be longer, that longer wingspan, then what you want to do is add more increases just at the edges, not in that center spine, just along each edge. So what you could do is also work increases on the wrong side rows. Generally, you're working those 4 increases on a right side row and then just working your pattern across the back to maintain your background stitch. But you can also add increases along just the edges on that wrong side row, and that would give you 6 increases worked over every 2 rows. Or you could double up on the increases on the right side rows just at the edges, not in the body of the shawl. And the same goes for other shapes as well. I'm working on an asymmetrical triangle shawl right now, which means you increase along that wingspan edge, then at the bottom you're decreasing, but you're working 2 increases at the top and 1 decrease at the bottom, and that sort of displaces the way your fabric is running, and it also gives it that asymmetrical shape and expands the wingspan. But I've actually added a second, or actually third increase along the top. So I'm increasing by 3, decreasing by 1. So I'm only increasing by 2 stitches every 2 rows, but it's giving the shawl a longer wingspan just across the top where you wrap it around yourself. And you can do this with lots of different shawl shapes. Look at the construction of the shawl and which increases are used to actually give the shawl its depth to the body, and which increases are used to increase the wingspan of the shawl. Sometimes they're the same ones, like in the example of the asymmetrical triangle shawl. All of the increases are going to increase the depth, but just adding extra increases along that top edge can also add more length to the wingspan itself. So yes, that's a great way to change a shawl shape, is by adding some extra increases to create a longer wingspan while not having to increase the depth of the shawl itself. But of course, this is also going to change how much yarn you need for the project. If the pattern tells you need a specific amount of yarn and you're adding extra stitches, then you're going to need more yarn to finish the project as well. But that is actually my preference. I prefer rectangle shawls to wear myself because I can make them longer for myself. But if I'm knitting more of a triangle shape, then I like to include those extra increases to give it a longer wingspan, and they're just easier to wear. Then Candy left a great question that's related to our discussion about fiber. We've been talking a lot about different fibers and how some of them are not very elastic, so you want to be careful about the garments you knit because they can end up droopy or saggy or something like that. So her question: do you know if knitting a strand of lace weight wool with a strand of sport weight alpaca would help it to not keep stretching when wearing a garment? And yes, it would. I don't know why I hadn't thought of that. Other people have done it. So it's something that you can definitely do, and it will give that yarn that doesn't have elasticity, like alpaca, like lots of plant fibers. They are not very elastic. So if you take one and then you use a strand of wool, a lace weight wool, really thin and fine, and hold it double stranded, then that wool can give you some amount of elasticity. Now, of course, you have to swatch to see how that fabric looks and feels, and to check the gauge, because it might change the gauge of your knitting. Most likely will, not just might, it probably will. And then also to see how much elasticity it will add depending on what your other fibers are. But that's absolutely a great way to add some structure to a type of yarn that doesn't have structure already. And her question can lead us right into our knitting topic of the week. We have been discussing fibers for knitting. We've discussed all of the different animal fibers, and now we're moving on to the plant fibers. And there are 2 categories of plant fibers. Plant fibers like cotton, which can basically be plucked and turned into yarn very simply, and then fibers that are called biosynthetics. The base material is plain plant matter, or biological matter, I guess, but it takes a synthetic process to turn it into yarn. And one example would be bamboo. That's what we're talking about this week. You can't just pull down a stalk of bamboo and start knitting with it. That has to be broken down in some manner, and it uses a synthetic process to break that down to become yarn. So I'm lumping them together though, because the final properties of plant fiber yarns and biosynthetic yarns are basically the same. So bamboo fits within that biosynthetic category, and it uses a specific process to break down the bamboo, and then specialized extruders that create the fibers, and then those are then spun into yarn. Now, it uses a synthetic process, but bamboo is a renewable resource. It grows quickly, doesn't need fertilizers and pesticides, and since it's a natural product, it's also biodegradable. So it's a great choice for those who are concerned about the environmental impact of their knitting choices. Now, we're going to dive into more of a deep discussion about bamboo, but then lots of other words, because bamboo falls in the category of rayon. I know rayon sounds like it's not a biological plant material thing, but it actually is. And then lots of other words as well. There's tencel, lyocell, modal, and viscose, and they all sort of fall in this category. Now, all of them come from natural wood sources, and they use a biosynthetic process to make the yarn. They all fit within the category of rayon. Now, rayon, that is the precursor to bamboo and all of these other categories. It was the first manufactured fiber that came from a natural source, and it used wood pulp. Now, this wood pulp was chopped and then put through this synthetic process to make usable fiber for materials and then also for yarn as well. Now, bamboo is basically a rayon, but it uses bamboo as the source material instead of this wool pulp. And then we have some of these other words that fall within that category of rayon. There's viscose rayon. Now, this is just one type. Now, this is made from wood pulp, but it can come from beech, pine, spruce, hemlock, eucalyptus, bamboo, soy, or sugarcane. Then there's also modal and lyocell. These are types of rayon. Tencel is one of the brand names you might see. So you might see any of these words. Tencel, I think, is used more for fabrics. I don't think you see that on your yarn labels. But you might see bamboo, you might see rayon, you might see modal, you might see viscose. Those are all basically a form of rayon, but they are all natural materials. They all come from some type of wood source to create the yarn. Okay, so modal, that's specifically from beech trees. Lyocell is produced from a variety of wood sources like viscose. Both of them have improved on the original processing methods from the original rayon. So you might not see rayon listed so much as maybe one of these other ones because the process has improved with time. It has less of an environmental impact because the chemicals that are used can be recycled. In original rayon, I don't believe that was true. And they're also stronger than viscose rayon. So all of these words, modal, viscose, bamboo, rayon, they all fit in that same category. They all came from some type of wood plant material, but they use a biosynthetic process. And another thing to note about that synthetic process. So this base matter, they have their plant matter, it uses some sort of chemical to break it down. Then it goes through an extruder, and the extruder can have like different sized holes or shapes, and that can affect what filaments are created. And those filaments are the strands that will be spun into yarn. So this is where you can get, especially more in acrylics and synthetic yarns, because the same process is used, you can get a lot of those novelty fibers because the different machines that they use, the extruders to create the different fibers, the way they spin them can create all of these different types of yarns. And you can see that with the rayon and bamboo, modal, viscose, you can see that as well sometimes. And this can also affect the structure of the yarn itself. Some yarns that are one of these could feel really soft and silky. Others might feel more like a hard-wearing cotton. It depends on how they've been processed. Okay, so advantages and disadvantages, and we're going to lump them all together because they all come from different wood sources and they could be processed differently, but in the end, they share the same basic traits. They're soft and smooth, beautiful drape. They are hypoallergenic and antibacterial. They're breathable, lightweight, fade-resistant, strong, and durable. They do have a few disadvantages though. They have a tendency to lose shape and they're inelastic. So like the other plant materials, they have that same problem with elasticity. They are susceptible to mildew and they lose strength in water. So you could combine it with like a cotton and have them for dishcloths because they're antibacterial and hypoallergenic, but because of that susceptibility to mildew and the way they lose strength in water, you want to treat them probably carefully. But they're also a great choice for warm weather garments because most of the time these are probably washable, maybe even dryable. I probably still do them on a gentle wash anyway for all your hand knits. So that makes them great for summer because they're breathable, they're lightweight, they're easy to care for, so they'd be great for baby garments and kids garments because they're soft as well. They also have beautiful drape and shine, depending on how they've been processed. So they're great for shawls and wraps and even accessories. They'd be nice for that as well. But I like them for summer garments especially. Because of course you're warmer, you might be sweating more. You want to wash them more often than you would like your wool sweaters in the winter. So easy care yarns are nice. But because of that lack of elasticity, you want to be careful about seamless garments because it could lose its shape. So you could try that stranding with a lace weight yarn or look for a structured yarn, like a yarn that has a chainette ply to it. It's not really applied. It's made into this tiny little I-cord and that gives the yarn structure. So you can knit a seamless garment with it or look for garments that have seams already or look for designs that use other plant fibers. They are sort of interchangeable with the designs. I think most of them share the same traits. So you could look at designs that used plant fibers specifically because the designer probably took the traits of those yarns into consideration when they were designing that garment. So if you'd like to look into different bamboo yarns and give them a try, I really like bamboo. I think it feels really nice. It wears really nicely. Then I'm going to have a link down below that goes to my website, and then it has a bunch of links to different yarns that you can check out that are blended with other fibers or 100% bamboo. I think I might have some of those there as well. So you can take a look at the different yarns and the different yarn lines that have these yarns available. Now, before I get to what I've been knitting, I want to share about this week's sponsor, which is Knit Picks. I really like Knit Picks. I drink out of my Knit Picks mug every day. This is my favorite mug. It says, I'm working on my PhD and then PhD here, project half done. So my favorite knitting mug. It holds a lot of coffee. I don't know if they sell these anymore. If they do, these are really nice mugs. They're nice and tall for those who like a little extra coffee in the morning. But anyway, they are having a sale on their fixed circular needles. You can get 20% off on fixed circulars. So if you're like me, you like interchangeables. I do. I use them for most of my knitting, but I do use some fixed circulars, especially when I'm knitting socks on Magic Loop, instead of pulling out my interchangeables. Oh, actually, my interchangeables don't even go that small. So a fixed circular in the sizes I like for socks works really well. Or sometimes if I'm traveling and I don't want to take my nice needles, then I take fixed circulars instead in case there's an issue or I lose something or something like that, then I'm not so concerned, And anyway, Knit Picks has some great needles, and right now they're having 20% off on their fixed circulars. I'll have a link down below so you can check that out if you're interested. Time to discuss what I've been knitting. I've been finishing up my master knitting, hand knitting program. The sweater's all finished. I showed a picture of it last week. Just needs a good steaming. I haven't done that yet. And I just finished the hat. I had finished it a while ago, but I never wove in the ends, but they're all woven in now. And I think actually looks pretty good where I wove them in. Not too bad. I think that, goodness, stranded knitting is so pretty when it's inside out, isn't it? It just looks really neat. But it's all finished and hopefully it passes. I went back and I read the notes in the letter that I got back with with level 2. So when you finish a level, you submit it, it gets reviewed, comes back to you with a really thick letter that tells you the things you passed, the things that you squeaked by on, and the things that you need to work on and resubmit. And the stranded colorwork pattern for level 2 is like this small wristlet. So you're doing stranded knitting, but you're also doing it on this little tiny circumference, which I think is actually harder than knitting a hat. I think I knit 3 or 4 of them before I even had one that I wanted to submit. And then I still had to redo it. It wasn't completely right. And my gauge wasn't great. I don't know. So I read that and now I'm concerned about my hat, but I keep looking at it and I think it's improved compared to where I was at that point with level 2, but I guess we will find out. But fingers crossed my projects will pass. That's the only thing I would really like. I don't mind like redoing swatches, but I really don't want to knit a whole sweater again, and hopefully not the hat. I hope it finishes, or I hope it passes. But here's a look at the binder if you want to see that. Everything's in here except for I have to write the patterns for the hat and the sweater. They're self-designed. You don't use somebody else's design. You have to design them from scratch and write the pattern. So that's all I have left to do. Everything else is finished and it's all in here. All my questions that I have to answer, the reports and book reviews I have to write, and then of course the majority of the work is swatches. There's an example, there's a swatch in there with like the paper that has to go with it. Now it looks like a lot of writing, it actually is, but I do it like one bite at a time. I would work on a section of swatches, like you have some that are just increases and decreases and decorative bind-offs and cast-ons. So I just focused on those and the things I had to do before I moved on to the next section, and it's all finished, ready to go. So I just have to get my patterns finished. I have all of the charts and the notes and everything, so I just have to I've been putting it off, honestly. I think the TAM pattern will be simple because it's all a chart, basically. You've got your basic information and then here, cast on this and then follow these charts. So that should be simple, but the sweater, it's going to be multiple charts and so many instructions, and even like there's some things that aren't really standardized. Like I cast on fewer stitches and then increased right away for the little cables in the rib. So there's not like I sort of used a lifted increase, but it's not really a lifted increase because it's along the cast on edge and it's worked differently. So I have to sort of figure out how to word those things because they're not standard abbreviations. So how can you explain it in words in a pattern to make it understandable? That's really my conundrum right now, but that's my focus probably for the rest of this week in my free time, is getting those patterns finished. Then I can get this in a box and mailed off, and I probably won't hear back for probably at least a few months because I think 3 different people will review all of the things in there before it comes back to me. Then of course I will have things to resubmit. That wouldn't be, I'm expecting that. I had things to resubmit for every level. Not very much for the first level, but quite a lot for the second level. And one of my projects, we have in the second level, there are 3 projects. You have a vest. You can use a pattern for that. You don't design it yourself. An argyle sock that uses intarsia. And then a little Fair Isle stranded colorwork wristlet. So the sock and the sweater passed with some notes. They were not perfect. They probably could have told me to redo the vest. It wasn't a sweater, it was a vest, because my seaming was not that well done, and I had a lot of, like, my tension wasn't great, and she pointed all of that out, but they didn't make me reknit the whole thing. But I had to redo all of my swatches that had seams because they were not that good. But because of that and other things like knitting other designs, I think I've really got the seaming thing down. I don't think that's going to be an issue with my sweater this time. At least I hope not. But we'll see. Anyway, so it's finished. It's ready to package up and mail off once I get those patterns finished. And pictures. That's the other thing. You have to show the designs on a person so they can actually tell that they fit a body. You know, like you're not just knitting these samples that won't fit anybody. So I've got to drag my daughter out and put them on her and take pictures. But that's all that's left to do with that. So I'm working on a sweater for my daughter. She wants a cardigan sweater with patch pockets and a shawl collar, just a plain brown color. It's inspired by a character I can't remember. I think from one of the anime she watches. She took a screenshot of it and said, "Can I have a sweater like this?" So I said, "Sure, why not?" So the back is done. I just finished all of the back neckline shaping. It's all finished. And I have started the front. This is the left front. I should be about ready to start the neckline and not the armhole yet, but they sort of overlap. It's one of those read both sections because you're going to have to work on both at once. I've got like a V-neck shaping going on, and then the armhole shaping as well. So I'm doing them. Sometimes I like to do both fronts at the same time, but I'm recording the process so I can do a little video about how to do the shaping. So I'm doing them separately. And the other issue I'm having, not really an issue, but I'm trying to think through the process, is usually I would block the pieces. I would wash them, pin them out to their measurements, and then I would sew them up because it's just easier. The pieces aren't rolling all in weird shapes, and it's just easier if they're flat and you can see the edges to seam up. But I'm doing this in acrylic yarn. I'm using Knit Picks Brava Sport Weight. It's 100% acrylic, machine washable and dryable, easy care, very soft for an acrylic. I know acrylics have improved a lot over the years. I'm thinking back to the acrylics my mom used in the 80s, and I remember not liking the feel of them very much. But anyway, I'm not sure what to do for seaming because honestly, I've never knit a sweater in pieces with acrylic yarn before. Normally, I use something that I can at least get wet and pin out and they'll stay flat so I can do the edges, but I'm not sure if acrylic yarn will do that. And I don't want to. I know that I could like use this. I have a handheld steamer, but that almost sort of kills it. And I don't want to do anything like that to it until it's like completely done. And then if I want to really set the fibers, I can use it at that point. But I don't think I want to do that before it's actually sewn together. So I think I'm going to have to test with the back. I might just like throw it in some water, not wash it and dry it, but just get it wet and squeeze it out and then pin it out and see if that will like give it enough flatness so I can sew the pieces together. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or tips for me, somebody who's sewn up a sweater that's done in acrylic yarn. I'd love to know how you did that because, well, you can see here's the back right now. It's all like just rolls up, and it's no fun to seam something that does that. You want, I mean, I can't even see the edge. I have to really unroll it to see it, and it just wants to curl up. So it's not fun to try to sew up a garment when the pieces are doing that, but I'm not sure how to fix that with an acrylic yarn. So if you have any advice for me, all I can think right now is I'm probably just going to have to get it wet and pin it while it's wet and see if that will at least give me enough time to flatten it, because I know washing it and throwing it in the dryer is not going to do anything. It's just going to curl right up. So I'm not sure. I'm going to have to give that a try, I guess, and I will let you know how that works out. And the next thing on my needles is a new design for an asymmetrical triangle shawl that's upside down right now. It's the same colors as the one that's behind me. The one back there is a top-down triangle shawl using Gauge Dye Works. It's their Whiskey in a Teacup colorway. The yarn back there is the Merino Cashmere Nylon Sock yarn. This one is their 2-ply fingering 100% superwash merino. And it's the same colorway, just different bases. And I'm using the same stitch patterns. Let me try to get this sorted out here. Okay, there is one tip right there. And it's going in this direction. It's growing quite a lot now. Very lumpy and bumpy looking. But every time the color changes, I change to a different stitch pattern. I'm alternating stockinette with 3 other stitch patterns, so you can see them moving. And then it gets to this large gray section, which is where I am now. So I've just finished like this row of eyelets, and then I'm working this simple textured pattern here. Then I'll do another eyelet row and then have like probably a picot bind off, just like that one back there. It's just a different shape. And the patterns will be coming out soon. And this one, because I added an extra increase, it does have that longer wingspan. You can see it sort of it's curling up. It curls up along that edge because the edge is quite long here, while it's not actually very deep. That's it for the depth. It's not very deep, but it's very long. So I like that in a shawl, and honestly, didn't have to use that, but it made the stitch patterns. I wanted the stitch patterns to be 2 rows only. Like whenever it switched, I didn't want it to be like you needed 6 rows of instructions to work the stitch pattern. Because of this yarn, like every time the color changes, you need to change, and I didn't want you to have to change in the middle of a stitch pattern. So I wanted the stitch patterns to just be 2 rows of instructions, the right side row, wrong side row. Then when the color changes, you switch to the next instruction for the next, with a few caveats, of course, so you don't get color blips on the right side of your work. So because of my rate of increase, and like a standard asymmetrical triangle shawl, you're only increasing by 1 stitch every 2 rows. So you're alternating between an even number of stitches and an odd number of stitches, and that affects your stitch patterns. And I mean, the way you write them, at least, because you have to account for, is it going to be an odd number of stitches? Is it going to be an even number? To make sure that you're using all of the stitches in the instructions for that stitch pattern. And I could not have done 2-row instructions for each of the stitch patterns if that were the case. They'd have to be longer because I'd have to change them depending on if it's an odd number of stitches or an even number of stitches. You can see designing has some weird issues sometimes. So I had to adjust my stitch count to add another stitch, which gives me that longer wingspan, but it also makes sure I always have an odd number of stitches on the right side rows. So I know that whenever I'm working one of those stitch patterns, as long as I account for that, so I'm always using an odd number, then it works out. Anyway, the stitch patterns are simple enough that all I needed to consider was whether it's an odd number or an even number. There wasn't anything extra. So for the different colored sections, all of the stitch patterns are just 2 rows of instructions, a right side row and a wrong side row. Now, of course, the gray yarn really changes things a lot because I have to be more specific. It's one larger section. So I do have a few ways I'm trying to write the instructions for that. using the weight of the yarn and then saying, you know, you need to have this much yarn for this section, as long as it's the same size. If you're making it larger with more stripes, and that's really the thing with this kind of a design is, unless, I mean, you can use the exact same yarn and get the exact same design, but if you want to use another yarn, then that might change this final section. So there's a lot to consider with this design, but it's really fun to knit. It's simple, but there's enough going on, you know, color changes, oh, better change to a new pattern, that it's interesting to me at least. So, and hopefully for others who might want to knit it. And the last thing on my needles is some convertible mittens for my father-in-law. I knit him a pair a few years ago, but I didn't make the tops long enough, so they tend to gap over his fingers. Like if he's holding his hand straight, the gaps open right there. And of course, if it's winter and you're shoveling, you don't want snow getting in on your mittens. So I told him I would knit him another pair. I didn't feel like taking those apart and redoing them because it's just easier to knit something new, I guess. So I had won some yarn in a giveaway from the Irish Knitting Podcast. Jamieson and Smith, their 2-ply yarn. So all I've done is a little gauge swatch. I had started on, I can't even remember what size, and I didn't like the fabric. It was just too tight and I didn't like the way it felt. So I went to not a US 3, I think it was a 3mm. There's a 3 in there. I think it's a 3mm needle. Just to do the little swatch. Oh, you can see right there, there's a ladder from the double pointed needles. That's something I gotta work on too, I think. The ladders between my needles. But anyway, so my swatch is done. I have blocked it, gave it a soak and just lay it flat to dry. So I've got to get my measurements, and then I'll be like, not designing this. I'm using a basic formula from the Mitten Handbook to knit them. Like, she's got a pattern for convertible mitts, but I don't think I'm even going to follow that. I'm probably just going to knit my own using my gauge. Let me see where that pattern is. Oh, there's the one that she has here. I'm not going to do the individual fingers or anything like that. But she also has like a worksheet so you can design your own. So I'm going to just use that and sort it out, but just basic rib. Maybe I'll have something interesting running up the thumb. I'm not sure. I actually have a mittens that my husband's grandmother was knitting. One of the last things she knit before she died. I don't know how long. She hadn't been knitting for a while. They'd just been stored away, and it's still, well, the second mitten is still on the needles. So I think I want to get them and put them in a shadow box and hang them on the wall, just to have. But the mittens themselves, they are just basic plain mittens, but the ribbing, it takes the ribbing for the gusset and it just continues it along each side. The rest of it's plain, but just that one touch. I really liked that, so I might do that on these convertible mitts. We shall see, but that's in progress right now. I have to get my gauge measurements finished and get that sorted, and then I will start knitting those mittens. Now, of course, it wouldn't be very nerdy if we didn't talk about any knitting books, and this week's book is the Harry Potter Knitting Magic book by Tanis Gray. Now, they're not all Tanis Gray's patterns. It's a lot of knitting designers have their patterns in here, but I thought because of the movie that's coming out, anybody else looking forward to that? We are. Actually, my daughter wants to go see Sonic and not Fantastic Beasts, so that's probably what we're going to see in April. We said we'd go to the movies, and most likely it will be Sonic instead of the new Wizarding World movie, but I'm doing a video on some Harry Potter inspired knits, so I had this book from the library, and I just love the patterns in here. They're so much fun. If you're a big fan of Harry Potter Wizarding World, there's actually 2 books now. There's this one, and then there's another Knitting Magic book. It has a different subtitle, same author though, just a different cover, and lots and lots of new patterns. So these are great for those people who love Harry Potter knits. And you can see some of the fun stuff. Of course, the striped scarves. And then I really like this scarf right here, that it's a Tanis Gray design. You show some of the the different transportation methods, and it's done in the round stranded color work. You can like adjust the length by adding different motifs to it, and then it's finished with a fringe. So it's lots and lots of fun. And of course, there's lots of little stuffies and things, like you can do your own head wig and little pixie. Lots of great designs. And oh, this is really fun too. That's one of the designs in there, this little mobile with all of the houses and their little animals. But the designs have like little lightning bolts beside them to tell you how difficult they are, which is a nice feature. Oh, there's another picture of that scarf. I just think that's so cute. So it includes some crafty creatures, the little pixie and Fluffy, the three-headed dog, and Hedwig. And then some replica garments from the movies themselves, like the Mrs. Weasley sweaters, the scarves, the Hogwarts house cardigans, and then like the inspired apparel, not from the movie itself, but just like inspired by the movies. There's a whole bunch of those. Fingerless mitts, pullovers, mittens, a capelet, beanies, and then even some decor. So lots of great patterns in here. Very, very pretty stuff. Oh, those are really pretty. Diana Walla mittens. She does some fabulous stranded colorwork mittens. I know she's got 3 or 4 on Ravelry as well. Their house, each of the houses, the mittens for them, and probably going to knit some for my daughter if I don't know when, but at some point, because they're just lovely. So lots of great patterns in here. So to celebrate the release of the new movie, even though I probably won't be seeing it right away, if I will probably be outvoted by the Sonic fans in this house, but it is on my list to see. But I'm probably going to rewatch the last movie because I can't remember very much of it. So as a refresher before this new. And anybody else looking forward to that movie? I'd love to know if anybody else likes stuff like that. And I'm thinking I have a video coming out probably in a month about the fun Harry Potter knits, but I was thinking of doing one about like replica garments from each of the movies, but I don't know if anybody would want to watch something like that. But if you would or would not, let me know. I like to dive in and find garments that could be used as a replica with maybe a few changes for garments from movies and TV shows. I'm always stopping. Does anybody else do that? Like if I'm watching something and I see a sweater or a hat or something I really like, I'm like, pause the TV and I'll try to take a picture of it just so I can have it as a reference later on in case it's something that I might want to knit for myself. But anyway, I can't be the only person who does that, right? Anyway, that is it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Leave your questions and your comments below and we can chat about them in the next episode. And if you're new here, I'll put a playlist right here so you can click right there and watch past episodes for this season. And I'll see you in the next video.